So, hello and welcome back to the final panel of the current series of Labels and Legacies, Embracing Intersectionality with Atif and some very special guests as well. So today is all about doing justice to intersectional stories through intersectional and inclusive communications. I'm going to just do some brief introductions before I hand over to the panel. So our chair for the day is, as always, Atif Choudhury, who is the CEO and co-founder of Diversity and Ability. Atif is an award-winning social entrepreneur with a background in economic justice and disability inclusion. As well as Diversity and Ability, Atif also co-founded Zaytoon CIC, is an advisor to the World Health Organization Rapid Assistive Technologies Board, and a trustee for Disability Rights UK. Also joining us is Onyinye Udokporo. Onyinye is a neurodiversity consultant, content creator, educator, and entrepreneur. Since being diagnosed with dyslexia at age 11, she's become a passionate voice for neurodiversity inclusion, helping schools and businesses design more neuro-inclusive spaces. She is the co-founder and CEO of Enrich Learning and the author of Dyslexia and Me. And we also have Kate Nash, OBE. Kate is the founding CEO of Purple Space, the world's only leadership development membership hub for disability employee resource groups and networks. Since its inception in 2015, Purple Space has grown to a global community of 4,000 plus leaders across 183 organizations. She is the author of 2 books, Secrets and Big News, which was released in 2014, and Positively Purple, which was released in 2022. And as of 2007, she has been awarded an OBE for services to disabled people. Finally, a little bit about Diversity and Ability. We're an award-winning social enterprise led by and for disabled people. We advocate for social change, equity, and inclusion on the macro and micro scale, delivering training and consultancy on intersectional disability inclusion across the globe. There's a QR code on the screen at the moment where you can find out more about our work dismantling intersectional barriers. One or a few final notes just before we start. So I've enabled captions. So if you would benefit from that, please feel free to turn on the captions. I'll also be pasting each question that Atif will ask the panel into the chat as we reach it to aid with processing. We've also been really grateful for everyone's contributions to the conversation before, during, and after the panels. Even since I've been speaking, I can see that there's 14 new chat messages for me to read when I hand over to Atif. So please do keep that conversation up. Use the chat and share your thoughts on social media as well, using the hashtag Labels and Legacies. We've added our LinkedIn name to the slide as well, handles into the chat so you can connect with us throughout the panel. And I'm now going to hand over to Atif to begin the discussions.
Thank you, Ellie. And thank you everyone for joining us today, wherever you are in the world. I'm amazed and always honored to see that there are people coming and joining us from places as far as South Africa and Bucharest, and of course, Brighton, which is where we are. And so I'm really excited to be here today and to have this conversation. I'm really chuffed and really feel very, let's use the word liberated, for language. I use the word liberated. We're liberated to have guests with Kate, with me, and Onyinye to join this conversation. As ever, so those of you new to the conversation, we're going to set a series of questions, not more than really 3 questions. And we're going to sort of discuss them as we go through this space together. But we're also going to, I hope, and I guess I say this each time, have a really meaningful conversation that's about inclusion, but it's also about the challenges of what that really means to move inclusion conversations into spaces that truly about true participation and about the intersectional realities of that participation, rather than what is often what dictates the terms of that is what is seen as acceptable because LinkedIn is focusing on it, or what is acceptable because workplaces are now saying it's time to talk about it. So we're going to talk about language, and we're going to talk about the use of language, but also it's about communication and what does that mean to be an effective communicator and an inclusive communicator. I put a thing in the chat to start us off with, though, as well, which it just really for me is about the power of language and communication. I won't read it I'll read it, just say that language is the power to control and intimidate or to share and participate. Reflecting on our intentions or the way we use language is the responsibility of very brave work. And it's the work we really get to do when we're just born somewhere. So maybe good intentions aren't always enough, but it's about reflecting and choosing to see where power is around us and where it prevents us from expressing ourselves because of certain rules, and whether we can reject those rules. And in rejecting it, do we liberate ourselves? I think we do more than that. I think we liberate people around us. I'm someone who struggled to make eye contact for years and very rarely wrote anything because I was worried about my spelling would say that I'm not bright. So the ability to look at somebody and say a story was really important because it was a story that needed to be told. I get to do it every day now, but there was a time when I just thought, how can I tell a story if I don't know the rules of their language or the way they decide it has to be? And you sort of got to realize is those rules may be liberating for some, but I wonder, and I guess that's the point of labels and legacies, that maybe the legacy is that they've left more people behind than we realize. And so how do we sit with that? Liberation is an important word to use here. And I think that people use the word peace quite often. And I think sometimes I think about the word peace and its intent, especially now. And sometimes it's used, I think about recognizing that it's also submission, to take it peacefully when a global word is liberation. So language changes, it evolves. So I'm going to sort of plant those seeds and ask questions around language, but really about inclusive communication. What does it mean to you, to me, to those of you listening today? Ask yourselves, if you get a quiet moment, what does inclusive language or communication mean to you? When have you ever heard it? When have you stopped to go, I learned something there that I wouldn't have really thought about because it never really occurred to me. So I'm going to ask, and I'm going to start with my guests I'm lucky to have. And if I may, Onyinye, I may start with yourself, if I could. If I ask you, what does inclusive communication mean to you?
Hi, everyone. My name is Onyinye. Thank you so much for the lovely warm welcome, Ellie and Atif, for having me here. And to be alongside a great woman like Kate is just an honor. So thank you. What does inclusive communications mean to me? Well, I am a child of immigrant parents. My parents immigrated from Nigeria. My mother, in my opinion, is particularly impressive because she speaks 7 different languages. And when I was growing up, I noticed that I had to help her a lot with English, like reading my school. They used to send these newsletters out every week at school. And it's not to say that my mother can't read. She is an undiagnosed dyslexic. And I have to use the term undiagnosed because where she's from, neurodivergence isn't accepted. There is no such thing as a diagnosis process. They don't even know what it is. So there's a lot of work to be done in that space. But she had always struggled with reading, writing, and spelling in the same way that I did, and came to terms with her diagnosis through my diagnosis. So there's just that background for you there. And inclusive communications from a very young age made me aware that simply sending out letters in English in font size 12 times New Roman, so that's a serif font that people with dyslexia struggle to read at the best of times. When English is language number 7 in your mind and in your makeup, it's not very inclusive. When we let's look outside speaking. I this morning spent time explaining to a client in advertising how it's important for us to stop creating ads that don't include British Sign Language. And I say that my mother speaks 7 languages. She's also gone on to learn British Sign Language because she works with young children and she feels it's important to be able to communicate with children who are nonverbal as well as those that are verbal. So again, inclusive communications, we go through all our days, even this session we're doing right now, assuming that everybody understands English, assuming that everybody can hear. also, to a certain degree, assuming that everybody can see, because this is a webinar and it's more dynamic if you've got the cameras on and can see people's faces, put a name to a face. So inclusive communications to me means something that is constantly evolving and progressing, because it's very difficult for us to say that we're going to be immediately inclusive all of the time. It's actually just not physically possible. For example, I don't know British Sign Language. At the moment, Atif and his organization, it's additional cost to have somebody translating what we're saying into British Sign Language. And it's not to say that that's not an important aspect or an important thing for him or all of us to be doing, but we also have to be practical in the steps that we take to be inclusive. But inclusive communications means constantly trying to consider the perspective of others. Ellie did something that's so important for inclusive communications. She started today's session by saying, if you need the captions, you can turn it on and the captions will be there for you. So you can follow us if that makes things easier. She also then said every question that is asked will be put in the chat box as we go along to help people with processing needs. Mm. To me, that's inclusive communications. It's something that's evolving. It's a work in progress. And most importantly, it's constantly considering the perspective of the other.
Wonderful. Wonderful. The perspective of the other. Absolutely. Absolutely. It chimes with what we talk about a lot here about the anticipatory welcome, that we anticipate that we won't always know, but that we welcome that we won't know, but we ask, or we try to recognize what is it that we can feel and act on that. How would we like to be received? But brilliant. Thank you. Kate, may I ask you as well for the same question? I'll repeat. What does inclusive communication mean to you?
Well, look, again, like Onyinye, thank you so much for the invitation. It's just beautiful to spend a wee bit of time with you both and our audience and our listeners and observers today. So it's a great question. Wow. Everything she said, no, that's the easy answer. I think for me, and a bit like Onyinye, how I frame the world is, of course, partly born from the experiences that I have had. So, I'm a white woman, has just reached 60. Today, I'm sitting here in a blue top. I have short brown auburn hair with some grey flecks. My background, I shared the story in my latest book, Positively Purple, but the short version is at 15, I acquired a significant and dramatic onset of a disease that I didn't think younger people got. So juvenile chronic arthritis, Still's disease, one of the rheumatoid arthritises. And I went from being a teenager running around a hockey pitch, I hated hockey, but what a way to get out of it, to some, youngster who couldn't walk, I couldn't dress myself, I couldn't feed myself, I couldn't contemplate going back to school or going to university or thinking about a job, let alone a career. And so I started to frame the world in a way that wouldn't necessarily make me feel ambitious about what the world had to offer, what we often now call the soft bigotry of low expectation. For me, had a deleterious impact on how I felt I could not just survive, but thrive. So to your question, it's a wonderful question. At Purple Space, we notice disability, neurodivergent and mental health ERG leaders grapple each day with the necessity to build inclusive communications into their organizations. And for me, where I came into this subject of language, the thing that really hooked me was how so often, many of the people on the call, we've all experienced those moments where we feel we don't belong. And that's often because there is a demand for greater metrics, greater measurements, better data. We're often invited to describe our self-ID experiences on HR systems, etc. But as humans, we often talk about disclosure rates, declaration rates, we're invited to admit our disability or to be honest, as if not sharing is a lie. So in Secrets and Big News, my first book, and to your question, inclusive communications for me is about creating environments where we know that we can belong. And belonging, as the great Brené Brown says, it's not about fitting in. It's about showing up and being who we are. As Onyinye says, it's about feeling able to be attached to those aspects of our identity that for others might worry about. So it's getting into that comfortable space, really. And, it's the ability to understand that language is a blunt instrument. Yeah. We have different heritages. Language is a very blunt instrument. So we have to work with what we've got. So I'm not sure if I've answered, but at least it's a warm-up answer to the better questions you've got.
Sure. You definitely have answered. Absolutely. And there is no wrong answer, isn't it? It's just, I think that there's so much of that about what we feel in our sincerity. And I think also what we feel safe to say, So inclusive language, if inclusive communication was anything as a benchmark, I guess it's what is the safety? If it's to be measured on anything, I don't know how we do that, but it's to be measured if anything at all, it's the safety it creates. And I think that's the wonderful joy ahead of us to say, how do we choose to measure that? And what's the power in that measurement? Can it be grassroots? Can it be driven by people marginalized? And can it inform our practice to the wider world? But most of all, is it just kind? Great. All right. So I'm going to now get to the second question, which I suppose adds to what we've just said, really. When and where have you seen intersectional diverse stories communicated in a way that honors rather than others' diverse experiences? And if I was to ask that, I guess I'm going to carry on in the order. If I ask you that question, and
well, I think we have the author of someone who has delivered the stories of so many Black and dyslexic individuals, Marcia. I think I saw her name. That's a really good example of where stories have been shared, and not just written and shared just for the sake of it, but shared with a compassion and with a love, and in a way that has opened doors for other people to be able to share in a medium that is most comfortable to themselves. And it's intersectional on the grounds of race and neurotype or neurodivergence, for example. That's a really, if you want a classic example of, well, where has that been done? And how does that honor rather than other? I think Atif allows me to be bold, so I'm just going to speak unapologetically here. The reason why I picked that example over so many that I could pick is because for once a Black person was given the opportunity to share Black stories. And that is so rare. And I'm going to explain to you why that is important and why that honors rather than others. In the past, myself included, I'll just use myself. I'm asked to share my story all the time. Very rarely, almost never, am I asked to share my story from somebody that is of a person of color. It's usually by a Caucasian person that comes with a certain level of privilege. And when they ask me to share my story, it also comes with, how do I put this? Ramifications, or it comes with a checklist. When you share your story, include this, exclude this, because our audience don't really they're not ready to hear that side of things. And in the process of you asking me to share my story, you other me, because you say to me, I like your story is powerful, your story is impactful, but hang on, don't tell us all of your story because we're not ready for that, or that's not in line with our commercial messaging, or that's not in line with our business goals, it's not in line with the objectives. And this is all the HR corporate speak that I hear day in, day out. And newsflash, I usually, if you start asking me to start cutting things out of my story, I turn down the work. I've turned down work worth thousands of pounds. And I'm not in a financial position to be able to do that. Like, I'm not so well off that I can say no to getting paid. However, if you're asking me to share my very intersectional story, a story that illustrates the challenges of being a woman, a story that illustrates the challenges of being Black, a story that illustrates the challenges of being from a working class background, a story that is reflective of what it's really like to grow up in a country that has so much wealth, but I'm in one of the most underserved communities that there is, like not just in terms of London, because I'm from London, but I'm talking about nationally. And then you're saying I have to cut out certain aspects. Respectfully, you can keep your paycheck and I can just keep it moving. And so I'll go on to say that I've given you an example of someone who is intersectionally sharing diverse stories in a way that honors, but I've also explained the importance of that and why I really hope to see a change in the world with the way in which intersectional diverse stories are being shared. Lastly, I'll say that the level of discomfort that comes from being made to share my story in a way that others has actually made me become quieter. So if you follow me on social media, for example, I've been fortunate enough to build a following on LinkedIn. I've actually not felt comfortable posting on that platform authentically in a very long time, because it's becoming a space where it's all right for you to share your story if you share it in a particular way and if you meet certain objectives. And that's just been my personal experience. And so when you don't allow people to share, everyone's story is intersectional, by the way, because I don't want people from white privileged backgrounds to think, oh, well, so does my story not matter? Everyone's stories matter and everyone's story is intersectional. But when you don't allow people to authentically share a story in a way that honors them, you get people like me going, I don't feel comfortable here, retreating and becoming quieter. And from the last couple of minutes, you can see that by nature, I'm not very quiet.
That's wonderful. Nor should you be, but absolutely. Onyinye, thank you. The credence, the sincerity of all of that. Absolutely. We are not here to go quietly into the night, whether we're asked to or not. We're just not here to do that. And also, fundamentally, we have a responsibility not to play small. There's generations counting on us to not do that. So I'm going to say thank you for not playing small, and thank you for Marcy's wonderful book, which I think we'll put into a link to that as well. I'm a big fan of the stories in it, and I had the honor to play a role in that book as well. But Marcy, I know you're listening, and it's wonderful. So Kate, can I ask a question of you? And I'll read it out to you. When and where have you seen intersectional diverse stories communicated in a way that honors rather than others' diverse experiences?
Yeah. But, it's still absorbing, Onyinye, your story, very, very powerful. And I suppose my observation on this is obviously through the disability ERG lens. That's what we do. And one of the things that we noticed at Purple Space was how, I suppose, energetic, how much more appetite the business community had to share the stories of their Black employees with disability when, of course, through COVID, we saw the Black Lives Matter movement. And there was there was an energy, there was an appetite to unearth the hidden stories, or indeed the stories that were not invited to be shared is probably a better way of framing it. So storytelling is a well-known tool within the disability ERG community. We see a lot of sophisticated methods, I suppose, by which those stories are invited to be shared within businesses. Three of my favorite examples, for example, Atif. So one, a big retail bank, for example, has a global presence. And one of the things, although they were well known for their storytelling when it came to their disability, their neurodiverse and their mental health community, what they had not done is to do a very good job of unearthing the stories of Black people. So what they chose to do was to headhunt, to offer a place of safety where those people who wanted to share their story could practice, because we know it's a lifetime art. You know, we get better over time. We share it this way and then we go, ooh, I don't quite like the way that landed. And we regroup and we do it again. So their objectives was to headhunt, to support and to train internal storytellers to be able to share their story and their unflinching truths about how it was to be a Black manager within this particular retail bank. They learned a lot about the necessity for safety, you know, the necessity for sometimes we have to practice. And we all know that the art of storytelling is never once and done. Even the best orators are forever learning their skills, and the way you can frame things to cause an audience to think, to feel, and to do things differently. And sometimes that is about being brutally honest about our stories. And Onyinye, to hear your experience where you're asked, I mean, my language, not yours, but tone it down. I mean, we all flinch with that. So this particular bank was very successful in enabling people to practice, to learn from each other, to find the big platform moments, and then to review and to go again. My other story I would share, the other way I've seen it done well is around allies programs. So we see a lot of purple allies programs, as I call them. So programs that support businesses to build more sophisticated criteria as to what makes a great ally. And although we've seen that for a few years when it comes to disability allies, we've not seen that intersectionality lens in quite as much vigor and energy, and we're starting to see that happen. So again, there's a professional services firm that we work with, an IT firm that we work with, who are looking to put that wash through their allies programs and to make it easier for those with white privilege to notice what they have to do differently and better in order to be a better ally for people of difference. So those are the two stories, but there's so much more to do. How long have we got?
not long enough, but
yeah,
but it's okay. I mean, this is the good work, isn't it? That that what we can do here, the best is plant seeds, right?
Yeah.
And I sometimes say this to people, look, it's not just about intersectionality or an intersectional conversation. It's also recognizing the commitment to an intergenerational conversation. That's for so long, people have not seen representation or felt representation. And so there won't be an hour or a day or a year or even a moment. There will be just a consistency that says, we belong here. It's okay. This is what we do around here. But until then, I think there's a debt that has to be paid. The wisdom that we lose, when women don't share their stories, or perhaps in particular Black women don't find safety amongst women to share their stories, or white women. So it goes on into what is it that says about the marginalization within a marginalization, and what is it that says how much we're just losing by not having that space just welcomed so safely on its own terms. And I think, Onyinye, you touched on it, and I feel it quite often myself. It's the fragility of the room that sometimes in the power balances of class, more than race, I think, sometimes class, that I feel I've got to somehow protect the fragility of that room. And I'm okay to do that. But there are other times I find it very tiring and it's had its toll. And then other times I think, and this is, I guess, the mental health loss of these things. Are we here because they want a brown person? Are we here because they just want us for who we are, because we know what we are and who we are? And I think that is an important question to ask, but it's also not to get swallowed up by it. But sometimes as we all do in life, we do get swallowed up by things. So brilliant. Anyway, so I'm ready to get to the next question as well, which is how we communicate is inherently tied to our culture, language, and behavior. I think that's really true. I'm going to put sort of caveat something that I feel like it's important to say, is that I also felt once, or I feel that way, that the English language is the most spoken language in the world, right? After that, it's Spanish in the context of colonial legacies, and it's a language that was, arguably, I'd say I'm going to be a bit passionate here, but it was taught down the barrel of a gun, to speak our language, to learn this language, Spanish, or learn our language as English, to trade or die. But we suggest you trade because that's better for you. It'll keep you alive longer. And to trade well, you better learn this language, and you better teach it. And so it went on and on. We have those legacies. And so there's a bit of power in that. But there's also a way of saying, what did it frame the world us through? So if you think about neurodiversity, which is an important one, will we ever know what autism would have looked like, in Nigeria? No, we can say it looks like this in the context of a British education system and how a British education system says, this is autism. And this version of autism is what you as Nigerians might look at. But it doesn't actually say, how would it have presented itself 200 or 300 years ago or 400 years ago before the arrival of Europeans? And what celebration would it have brought in the differences of people? It's very difficult to undo that. But I'm really sort of saying it's a good conversation to start off, to ask the questions, how we communicate is inherently tied to culture, language, and behavior. I'd even say perhaps even trauma. So how do we balance the need to adhere to accessible guidelines with an intersectional approach that recognizes how each individual needs and preferences differ? Onyinye, can I start with you on this?
So Atif, the truth is we could do a whole session just on question 3 in terms of my personal experience. It's a heavy question. How we communicate is inherently so tied to our culture, language, and behavior. Well, I'm from Edmonton, and I don't even know if I can do the accent anymore, but I didn't used to speak like this at all. My parents speak Igbo at home. My mum speaks Igbo and Hausa as well as English. And I have been brought up in a culture where it's hierarchical. So children, my parents didn't raise us this way, but the culture is very much this way. Children speak when they are spoken to. And as a female child, you must certainly do not lead from the front. I write about this extensively in my book, like how challenging that was for me, because I'm the firstborn of 4 children. Culturally, people want their firstborn child, particularly in the Igbo culture, to be a boy. So when I arrived and I wasn't a boy, there was all sorts of like things I had to contend with. And then my father in particular is very liberal in his thought process. So he thinks it is, of course, ridiculous to want a boy over a girl as the first child. And so he championed me as a female. But then in public, I had to retreat because, I didn't want people to think my parents were weird for not adhering to the culture. So that's my culture. That's language and that's behavior. How do we balance the need to adhere to accessibility guidelines? Well, my poor parents thought, you know what, if we send her to a very privileged white upper class elite boarding school and remove some aspects of the culture and tone down how much we speak the language and put her in a space where she can learn the behavior that will enable her to climb the professional ladder, that's how we can adhere to certain accessibility guidelines. I've not even mentioned my neurodivergence because let's not even go there. If we're talking about the culture and the behavior, we don't even mention that where I come from, where my parents come from. So it was really difficult. I got to, I would say about 20, 21 years old, where I realized that, hang on a second, all this unlearning that I've done is basically meant that I'm wiping away my identity. And I had to find new ways of balancing methods and ways to become like accessible. How we can do that is creating space for people to quite simply come as themselves. Is creating space for people to understand that all those things, culture, language, behavior, don't try to erase them. Like, this is a part of who you are. An intersectional approach that recognizes an individual's needs and preferences requires you to simply just be accepting and hold people to account. The first time I met Atif, you want to know the truth? I was saying this just before the webinar started. He held me to account of the fact that I kept apologizing for who I am. I kept apologizing for where I was from. I kept kind of making excuses for my being. And I really didn't want to dive into the intersectional being that I am. He created a safe space. And I know a lot of you are going to be thinking, okay, Onyinye, so how can we create that safe space? Two things: patience, kindness. It took me, I'm 25 now. I met Atif when I was 21, 22. It's taken me 3 years to get to this point. Patience, kindness. It's taken me finding spaces and people that will be kind and loving and appreciative of my culture, of the language, of the behavior. And then I'll take it a step further. It's taken me the time and space to build the confidence to go out and tell people who look like me, who come from backgrounds like myself, to do the same, because I don't believe in working in silos. I can't be the only person driving home that message. It's not healthy. And actually, not even just people that simply look like me. I've also gotten people who look nothing like me from a different generation to me to also be sending out that same message. Look, I'm here with Kate. We're doing this together. Kate has told us that she's 60, doesn't look at those. So if you want to drop some recommendations onto the secrets of youth, then I would be grateful. We were speaking about where she spends most of her time, Swansea. I'm in the depths of North London, totally different background, but we've come together and we're both championing the need for creating space for people to be honest about their individual needs and their individual preferences.
Onyinye, thank you so much for all of that on such a personal level as well. Yeah, it was Anna Voskamp who said, shame dies when it finds a safe place to tell a story. Yeah, I think that's our goal here, is it? That we can not just find safe places, but we, in solidarity and allyship, we create them too. You know, what a joy to say, despite this pain, I get to do this. You know, despite these things, look what I get to do. So I want to, conscious time. Kate, I want to ask you the same question. I would love to read it out to you as well, if I can do that. Or so. I'll say it for the audience as well. How we communicate is inherently tied to our culture, our language, and behavior. I always say, like, shame, to traumas, those things. So how do we balance the need to adhere to accessible guidelines with an intersectional approach that recognizes how each individual needs, it recognizes individual needs and preferences and how they differ? How do we do that when sometimes it can come across as paternalism, right? That is the global South being told what to do by the global North all the time about what labels they should have and not have. How do we actually do that well, in your perspective?
It is a great question. And Onyinye, to your question, makeup and mirrors, that's how I do it. Well, let me answer this in a similar way to my dear colleague here. So I'm going to share a little personal story, and then I suppose come back up to the how do we do this from a systems perspective. So the personal story, and again I share it in my latest book. I remember at 15 when I couldn't walk, couldn't dress myself, couldn't feed myself. hope to go to university, but it really was a hope. It was a dream. There was no such thing as the then Disability Discrimination Act or the Special Educational Needs Act that, of course, became the Equality Act. I had my fingers crossed behind my back that I would be able to go to a university that would then honour or gift me the opportunity to get into inaccessible buildings. But a particular story, when I was waiting for treatment at 15 years old, my bed had been brought downstairs, an inaccessible house, and I could hear my young friends, school children, going into the school where we lived opposite, and I could hear the hubbub of children's voices. They were or had been my contemporaries, and I was very far removed. And I overheard my parents talking about whether they could afford to pay for my mum to go in to get the shopping by taxi because she didn't want to leave me. And so could they afford quite literally a taxi? And they couldn't. So I remember my dad giggling, and you'll get me when I say this, saying, well, Barbara, you'll just have to walk very quickly. And he didn't mean that. He was trying to lighten an altogether challenging family situation with a lightness of touch. But what did I learn from that story? I learned that as a working class girl who had a profound disability that was likely to leave me with significant physical challenges for the rest of my years, how could I learn? How could I get my first qualifications, that first job, etc.? And when trying to apply to university, all I got was a barrage, I suppose, of requirements to describe how active I was. Was I head of the sports team? All of those communications were designed to exclude somebody with significant physical challenges. So I learned very quickly, I suppose, the necessity, the duty, I think, that we all have to make it easier for others to notice that we belong, whether that's in employment setting, communities, and so on. So to the question, that's the backdrop. My backdrop is what can we do to make it easier to bring people of difference into our world? And the best I could offer here, directly to your question, I think we have to remind ourselves always on the principles upon which the original Disability Discrimination Act was written. And that was that to build fair, equitable and accessible working worlds, in this case, we need to do two things. We need to remove the barriers for groups of people. So those things that the majority of people maybe with mobility impairments might have, or neurodiverse experiences, so there are some things that are very similar across the same disability group. So employers, service providers have a duty to do that. But equally, the legislation allows us to make adjustments for individuals. In other words, no two people with the same type of arthritis is going to interface with the world in the same way. So those two principles, I think, are the bedrock of accessible communications. It's things that we can do generically to share that everybody may belong, but recognize that we're all incredibly different. And that's a very sophisticated message. And of course, it's the reason, or one of the reasons, why disability rights legislation was behind the curve, because it's complex, because there are themes and truths that we share across impairment groups, but it always requires individuals to act. And that's hard. There's no getting away from it. It's hard. If your line manager hasn't experienced people of different disabilities, it's really hard. So I'm not excusing that. I suppose my perspective is it's a complex thing to get right. And I think we're positively on that journey, but of course we have a wee way still to go. So I hope that does it.
No, absolutely. And I suppose it's just wonderful, just a really gentle and wonderful reminder of it is about individuals, it's about humans and the joys and aspirations of us to feel included and welcomed. And I think, I want to say I'm a bit of a fanboy moment, but having you here particularly has that space for me in the way that you're speaking of what's happened in legislation and what Purple Space has done. I deliberately wore purple today, so you're here, and I think, Onyinye, maybe you got the memo too.
I'm letting the side down. There is purple in my necklace, I promise.
No. So there is a lot here, and I think that's really positive and important to sort of look at what is the work ahead of us, and it's real. It's urgent, but as I said, it is intergenerational as well as intersectional. So at this point, I guess I'd like to throw to you both, to ask this question, and I might ask, and I'm going to throw it to both of you as to who wants to take it first. But my questions, I suppose, is what is always asked is, what is it that keeps us hopeful then? For an audience listening, what is it that says, okay, because so many people are underrepresented, so many people are or their representation is done for them and not with them, And as we rightly said, we are talking about individuals and humans and the hearts of humans. So my question is, I suppose, knowing that and the gravity of that, what is it that keeps you hopeful? I'm going to throw that out to either of you as to see. May I?
I've got three things that keep me hopeful. I spent some time reflecting on this properly. The first thing is nothing about us without us. Conversations like this keep me hopeful because it's a conversation where Atif and his team have very cleverly and then very intentionally included people of very different backgrounds, of very different ages. Okay, we identify as the same gender, but putting that aside, there's been some real depth in the thinking towards putting together this conversation. It's not just been a panel that they thought needs to happen and, we'll pick two names that are big in their own right and that will bring people in. No, it's been well thought out. So first thing is nothing about us without us. That's what keeps me hopeful is organizations driving that mantra and also living by it and practicing it. The second thing is the growth in the stories that are being told by communities from those communities. So I'll make that clearer. Let's take Marcia, for example. She's a Black woman who is delivering the stories of not just other Black women, but just other Black people. And that's rare. That doesn't happen very often. Those types of opportunities are hard to come by for people of ethnic minority. And also those opportunities are hard to come by for people from working class. Kate's story has really pulled my heartstrings. The fact that she was so unwell as a teen and her parents couldn't even afford a taxi. And look, there isn't as much help out there as people think. They had to just get on with it. Her dad had to make light of the situation with a joke, but it was actually a very serious situation. The fact that she is able to lead on telling the story and creating space for others from her background, from a similar background, to tell the story in a safe space, that's what keeps me hopeful. And the last thing is a more personal reason that keeps me hopeful, but has been my own personal growth, actually. I'm sure Atif is sitting here looking at a completely different young person in comparison to who we met a couple of years ago. That gives me so much hope because I never believed that I would have the confidence or the maturity to be able to do the work that I'm doing. And also Atif's made me realize that being hopeful doesn't mean that you don't have to be angry. Because sometimes anger it's an important emotion because it fuels you to make the change. Kate did not build her organization from a place of happiness. Let me tell you that now. She doesn't even need to tell us, but I can tell you from my own experience that what keeps me hopeful is the fact that the world is coming to an understanding that anger is not always negative. There's a positive, and that positive means that there will be change. So thank you.
Wow. Wonderful. Onyinye, thank you. We are so in debt to your fire, It's going to keep a lot of people warm as the years go ahead, for sure. Kate, you also, what keeps you
listening to that beautiful, beautiful description. So look, couple of things keep me hopeful. One is the knowledge that ultimately people want to do the right thing. Ultimately, we live in a complex and challenging world. We look at the news and, we would be forgiven to feel heartbroken by some of the things that we see, whether that's in politics and the erosion of democracies, whether it's about war. And yeah, I choose, I think we all have default personalities, but I also think the way we think is partly predicated on our ability to exercise choice as a muscle. And I choose very deliberately to believe that ultimately people want to do the right thing. Sometimes we will be tested, sometimes we're challenged, and sometimes we will experience the complete opposite. But ultimately, I think people want to do the right thing. And so what does that mean in our world? It means that some people stuff up, and if we bring that to light, the majority of people will apologize and they'll feel bad for a little while, and then they'll learn. And then they'll come back and they'll do it differently. And I think mostly as people, that's the cycle that we go through. And we learn that for ourselves, just because we work in this trade, that doesn't necessarily mean we've nailed it all. And then the second thing that keeps me hopeful is just meeting others who nurture the spirit of being positive. The closer we work together, Atif, I just so enjoy your work. Your leadership at Diversity and Ability is just extraordinary. Your team, the magic that you create in this world. And Onyinye, your writings, as a great orator, and Marcia's work. And there's just some fantastic writers and orators who just keep that spirit alive. And I think what I really like are the publishers now who are noticing some of these great writings. I had the pleasure of working with Chris Cudmore at Kogan Page, but there's many out there. You look at Hitachi, for example. You look at Alison Jones's work, Ex Macmillan. They are genuinely committed to bringing to life the great voices to people of difference. And that really keeps me hopeful. Yeah.
Yeah, wow, what a wonderful thing to finish on. I absolutely agree with you. And there are days I think we all feel a bit cynical, a bit worn out, a bit beaten up. We run out of spoons, and we just think, screw it, But in truth, that's what can be more human, just to be able to belong in a space that says it's okay just to be angry. It's okay to be tired. It's okay to feel this is enough, But it's also how liberating it is to really at the heart of it and to dig deep enough, and not often have to dig that deep, actually. I agree with you, Kate, and also with you, and Onyinye, that people want to do good. Isn't it wonderful, for the most part of all the things and the marginalization and a lot of the suffering? And it's quite often the very people that are marginalized the most are the people that want to do the good. And it's all around us, We just got to let it receive us, But brilliant. I'm going to hand over to Ellie. I want to say thank you both from my heart for this session. I don't know how much I've needed it today, but I really felt it. So anybody listening as well, if you've needed it, felt it, say in the comments. But really, thank you. Ellie, over to you.
Thank you. I completely agree. And just watching the chat as well has really added to that, like how much I've felt it today. So thank you all for really embodying our vision for these panels as well, by truly reflecting on labels and legacies, and the impacts. And as we move to a break before we return, I want to think about something that Onyinye and Kate both touched on, which is that responsibility that we hold to notice the quiet. And notice when quiet doesn't necessarily mean agreement or that we've successfully included, but instead speaks to burnout, to insecurity and vulnerability, and the trauma that comes with telling your story, especially when the agency to tell your story in a way that feels right to you has been stolen from you. So as well as the stories that the three of you shared in your own ways, we've seen that happen in the chat as well. So I really do want to thank everyone who shared their stories and felt safe to do so in the way that felt right for them in this panel. And that for me is a sign of hope as well, that we can start to speak for ourselves more and more and have the space to do that. So yeah, thank you to Kate and Onyinye and to Atif as well. And that brings us to the end of 6 months of unveiling labels, legacies, so much more. As a reminder, all of the recordings from the last 5 panels are already live on our YouTube channel, which is linked on that screen that I'm sharing now. And we'll also be uploading this final video as well. So keep an eye out, and we will be back as well. So thank you all, and goodbye for now.